Welcome to Recovery Equity, a series of conversations about how we can reach and help more people find freedom from substance use disorders, commonly referred to as the disease of addiction. This is a space for us to reflect on some hard truths and to consider ways forward and even new possibilities. I am Dr. Quyen Ngo, and I'm a licensed clinical psychologist who leads the research at the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation.
And I'm Randi Tolliver, a master trainer consultant for Hazelden's Professional Education and Continuum Solutions Division. I hold a doctorate in clinical psychology, but I'm not currently practicing. Instead, I serve as a trainer consultant providing support to behavioral health and medical providers seeking to improve their practices, especially as they relate to the integration of services and ways to serve the entire person and the communities in which they live and work. Today, Quyen and I are continuing to lay the groundwork for our new Recovery Equity series. We hope today's conversations, and again, the ones that follow, will reach a wide audience, including people of color in recovery, family members impacted by recovery, service providers, and any other allies who are interested in promoting recovery equity. Based on these conversations, we hope people will be touched by something said. Connect to this experience, be heard, be seen, and find space and encouragement to develop better connections with those they meet. And we hope you will join our conversations and Hazelden's commitment to learn together, listen openly, appreciate cultural and community diversity, amplify unheard voices, think differently, challenge the status quo, and take action to change.
Thank you for joining us today. We at Hazelden Betty Ford have been talking for quite a while about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in our previous welcome episode, I referenced the fact that I am broadcasting from the Twin Cities area in Minnesota, where in the summer of 2020, we witnessed the murder of George Floyd and the social unrest that came out of that. And that really spurred our conversation around DEI forward even more as an organization. And it really pushed us to think about how we were approaching DEI and what exactly we were doing with DEI. So Recovery Equity is a series that has come out of those conversations, but we've also really worked to push those efforts forward, to really establish a formal DEI group within our organization that's working across our organization to advance conversations and ways to address diversity, equity, and inclusion in our organization. And I think an important part of these efforts too is a group that Randi and I have worked hard to establish and to foster and support, specifically for the staff of color in our organization. So it's not a part of that formal process of DEI. It's what I call DEI adjacent, but it has become a real safe space for our staff of color to meet and to talk about our experiences and to really support each other in understanding how to navigate our organization as staff of color when issues may come up, when challenges come up. And so that's been a really important initiative too, in addition to the formal structure of our DEI group. And Randi has been an amazing partner in moving that forward. And there we do talk about equity. And part of that is recovery equity and how we serve the people that we serve.
And, Quyen, thanks for talking about what we've done, because I think that group that we're a part of is really starting to inform and help change some of the work that we're doing within Hazelden. And so it's great for people to have seats at the table, as we often talk about, so that we can really impact and make some positive changes within the organization. So as Quyen mentioned, we're talking about recovery equity. What we want to cover during today's conversation are a number of terms: recovery equity, privilege, intersectionality, and hopefully be able to have some time to talk about the impact of trauma. So let's look at the two words that make up recovery equity. So recovery, we generally point to SAMHSA's definition, which is a process of change through which individuals improve their health and wellness, live self-directed lives, and strive to reach their full potential. Recovery means different things to different people, but at its core is a spirit of hope. Hope or belief that changes can happen and that the change process occurs through relationships or social networks. So when we think about the group that Quyen just described, a lot of that group is about forming relationships, finding support, finding safety. It's a social network. We define equity in terms, in sometimes general terms, as the quality of being fair and impartial, where everyone receives the supports they need. And this is a concept that is very different than equality. The equality in recovery is where everyone benefits from the same supports, but there's a failure to recognize the individual needs and of individual, and there's a failure to look at how wonderfully unique people are. So given that definition of equity and our definition of recovery, we're defining recovery equity as the ability for anyone and everyone to, one, access culturally responsive treatment and recovery services, and two, receive the support needed to experience healing, find freedom from substance use and mental health disorders, and nurture their well-being. We want this level of equity for individuals, families, and communities. We also recognize that recovery equity is, like I said, a newer term and evolving. So in some ways, it's still being defined, and I hope we are able to engage in some of that definition as we go forward. It's also helpful when we consider that language matters. And I've said this before, but it's worth saying again. The words we use matter. So I use the example of, we've heard that it said that we're not neutral beings, that we're either moving forward, moving towards something or away from something. We're encouraging a behavior or a way, or we're discouraging it. And so that's a good place to see such influence of or impact of what we do and what we say is in our language, especially when we talk about the use of stigmatizing and non-stigmatizing language. So again, on our teams, we often talk about individuals who use substances or have a substance use disorder versus an addict or an alcoholic, because our words matter and our words influence how people think. So we have to watch our words. You know, Quyen, our definition of recovery equity also makes me think of something we talk about quite a bit, which is privilege. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, well, you know, every time this word comes up, I can just feel everybody become tense in the room when we talk about privilege. Why is it so hard for us to talk about privilege? You know, and I think people think, you know, privilege has become like this dirty word. Don't say the P word, you know, don't mention privilege. But privilege is really just about acknowledging the advantages and disadvantages that different individuals and different groups have. And just because, you know, the term white privilege in particular can be really upsetting for individuals.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not about saying, you know, that if you have a certain kind of privilege that you have never suffered, you haven't worked hard, and that you have a silver spoon in your mouth and you don't know what it is to, you know, to work for what you have. That's not what conversations around privilege are. You can be privileged by race. You can be privileged by economics, your socioeconomic status. You can be privileged by education. You can be privileged by gender. There are all of these different levels of privilege. And it's just acknowledging that there are certain norms in our society. What is considered normal? Who makes the rules? Who benefits from the rules? And if you benefit from the rules, then you are privileged in that way. You know, I take myself as an example. I'm a daughter of immigrants. I'm a first generation college goer, first person in my family to have a PhD. You know, I did not come from privilege. When I grew up, we didn't have a lot of money. So I didn't come from privilege, but I can acknowledge that now I am in a privileged place. My education provides me with a privilege that I didn't have growing up, but I have now. You know, there are ways in which I am privileged. And in order for me to understand how I relate to the world and how the world relates to me, I need to acknowledge the ways in which I'm privileged. There are ways that I'm not privileged, don't get me wrong, but there are definitely ways that I'm privileged. And it's that process of talking about, what is normal in our society, in our everyday, what is the norm and who benefits from it. That's really the conversation around privilege. So I don't know, Randi, if you want to add anything to that idea of privilege.
I really appreciate that you talk about the privilege that you have, and I, have a similar experience where, yes, there are disadvantages that I face, but there are also privileges that I experience because of the doctorate or because of other factors. And I appreciate the view on both sides of it, that we're able to look at, again, the whole person. And I think that's what we are often leaving out in some of the conversations. I think that's what you're also going to be talking about in intersectionality, which is it's actually one of my favorite things next to cultural humility. So
That's right. That's right. So that moves us right into intersectionality, because intersectionality, which is a term coined by Dr. Kimberle Crenshaw. We always got to shout out to the people who come up with these concepts. She's a phenomenal scholar and still doing amazing work. So, but Dr. Crenshaw is the person who really coined the term around intersectionality. And it is really understanding all of the different ways in which pieces of our identity converge in us as individuals and influence the way that we move through the world and the ways in which the world interacts with us. So it is that intersection of your economic background, your racial background, your gender background, your cultural background that converges in each of us as individuals and as individual groups as well, that interact with the world around us. And that's really what intersectionality acknowledges. And this is really a term that comes out of Black feminist scholarship. And so it's a term that really defines the complexity of life and living in groups of us. Now, the tricky thing about intersectionality too is that it can also be used to stereotype, which is interesting, right? You can take that idea of intersectionality and say, oh, Asian women are like this, and just reduce them to sort of that least common denominator. So that's kind of the danger. So it is a way to complicate the way we see each other, and we have to be careful not to use it then to reduce us to stereotypes as well. And there are different kinds of intersectionality too. There are similar experiences. So women, regardless of race, may have specific experiences that are common to women. That experience of being in a room full of men and raising an idea or an issue that no one listens to until a male counterpart says the same thing. And everyone's like, oh, that's a great idea. That was really insightful. Most women or many women can identify with that. So those are similar experiences that may happen. But then there are also additive or multiplicative ways in which intersectionality can impact. So it's, for women of color, it's being a woman, it's being Asian in background, it is coming from a low socioeconomic status group. All of those things add up and influence my experiences moving through the world and the way the world treats me or has treated me in the past or does interact with me. So those things stack up. And it's not always additive. Sometimes it makes it much, much worse, right? So we see this, for instance, in the health disparities, particularly among Black people in our country. Right? It's not just that you're Black. It can also be because you're a Black man or a Black woman that impacts in much greater ways than just adding those two together, that impact your overall health, your life expectancy, the health of pregnancies, and your outcomes for addiction and recovery. So it's not just adding it up, and then there are ways that intersectionality speaks to very unique points. So, we had these similar experiences of all women, but there are ways that people view for me, Asian women in particular that are unique to my experience. And I'm sure, Randy, for you, Black women in particular that are unique to you that I don't experience.
I believe that kind of understanding of culture and intersectionality is essential to our ability to see, kind of, as you said, a person in their whole being. So I'm also happy to just say that, again, Dr. Rashida Fisher will be furthering this conversation in the Recovery Equity series about cultural and cultural competency and cultural humility. So I think we'll have more of this. Quyen, I'm also really excited and encouraged by the opportunity to engage in these conversations around recovery equity, and to begin with, as you were saying before, the focus on the Black community, because I know we wanted to talk a bit about trauma, and as we've seen in the last year, and as we've known throughout our lifetime, significant gaps exist in racial equity and justice. And so this recent Pew Research Center finding indicated that, so it's been 150 years after the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, but many adults in the US say that the legacy of slavery continues to have an impact on people of color, Black people in America today. And at least 4 in 10 report that the US has not made enough progress towards racial equality. So, you described how privilege affects us, and that supports and research to which we have access kind of impact that, but trauma impacts that as well. So I think it's important to note, a lot of times when we talk about trauma, people think about individual experiences of trauma. And that's what we'll say. We'll say, like, something happened and there was an event that occurred to one person. This was a single event or a multiple event that was happening over time. And so the trauma is a result of the exposure to this stressful event that's overwhelmed the individual's ability to effectively cope with that stressor. But individual trauma is really different from community trauma. And community trauma is what impacts social groups or neighborhoods through interpersonal violence, structural violence, or historical harms. And yet historical trauma is what happens to groups of people. So, as defined by Dr. Braveheart, again, giving credit out there, historical trauma is the cumulative emotional and psychological injury or wounding over a lifetime and across generations resulting from massive group trauma. So the interesting about historical trauma is that these events target not just an individual, but the whole community or the collective. And this trauma is held personally across generations, such that even those who have not directly experienced the trauma can feel the effects generations later. So that is that these events are kind of embodied or personally held and passed across from one generation to the other. So people can feel it. So when we see individual trauma becomes collective, it's because it impacts a significant portion of the community, and that impact is compounded. And then it's these continuing traumatic events or assaults that can affect our brains and our bodies. And that includes our psychological functioning. And so that psychological, that impact on the body and brain can then interfere with our ability to effectively cope, and not only with existing stressors, but with new stressors. So again, as you start talking about kind of what happens and what predisposes groups to diabetes, to PTSD and other things, there's a vulnerability that's increased. This is also interesting because there's a body of research that's starting to examine the impact of historical trauma and stress at the cellular level. So that's the neurological toll it takes on a person. And it's amazing to think that the stressful environmental conditions can actually leave a mark at the cellular level in the body that is passed on and on. And so getting us back to kind of race and a recovery equity, we know that African Americans have suffered from multiple traumas: cultural, historical, intergenerational, and that's as a result of slavery, racism, and discrimination. And these are all types of stressors. And so we understand the negative impact of widespread racial discrimination against African Americans and other people of color. The good thing is that much work is being done to support the development of trauma-informed and then trauma-responsive systems. And ideally, these practices are taking a look specifically at being culturally responsive too, or taking into the context of culture. So Quinn, there are two terms that I think are used a lot that I really want to, I think it's beneficial to differentiate the two. One is trauma informed and the other is trauma responsive, because these are, again, words that are used a lot, but I want to make sure that we are clear on what they mean so that we can make meaningful steps to accomplish this. So trauma informed is a type of universal precaution. It is what everyone needs to know about trauma, adversity, and violence and their impact. It's the knowledge, it's the awareness. Trauma responsive is what we do based on that knowledge. So it is when we start to respond differently, we start to do things differently. And it is when all organizations and individuals start to create change, whether it's in policies, whether it's in practices, whether it's in how we view and serve and interact and connect with others. But all of it's done to increase the likelihood of health and recovery for everyone. I mean, there is another term about trauma specific, but that's usually just used to describe those specific interventions and environmental techniques more in a more of a kind of a treatment setting. And during the past year, I've often been reminded that many of our friends and colleagues of color are not only impacted by historical trauma, but are simultaneously working to navigate within systems where they experience imbalance and sometimes a significant amount of daily stressors. And that is one of the many reasons I think it's vital that we work within a trauma responsive framework so that we avoid traumatizing and re-traumatizing each other. So the takeaways is that we practice the 4 R's of trauma-informed response. So we realize the prevalence of trauma for an individual group, in this case, African Americans or people of color, Black individuals. We recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma. We respond using trauma-informed responsive principles, and we avoid re-traumatizing. And I was thinking of that when you talked about the things that we say, when we talk about the language we use, when we talk about sometimes our implicit and explicit bias, which is something I know we didn't even get into. But all 4 of those elements are essential because we need to do no harm by being aware of past and ongoing trauma. It's important that we accept and meet others where they are, and we set our expectations accordingly, that we empower individuals in our communities, and that we actively respond to new developments and knowledge and adjust what we do. So we kind of have to keep on learning. We have to keep on learning.
Right. I mean, I agree completely. And this really does connect straight back to that idea of intersectionality, because how you experience trauma is directly related to your identities and the ways in which you may or may not have been privileged within the Black community. That is all related and all linked to the historical trauma. For African Americans, that's related to the historical trauma experience. That is all connected. So I think these ideas, and some people might ask, why are we talking about these things? We're talking recovery equity. Why are we bringing up these things? Well, because recovery equity is linked to all of this. When we think about who has access to care, who has access to treatment, we have to acknowledge who is privileged enough to have that access. As difficult as it can be, there are individuals who are more privileged in that way. And why are they privileged? Because of these intersecting identities that meet in us. And then how all of this is related to then the impact of trauma on individuals. And, we haven't even gotten into conversations around the historical trauma that has happened with communities of color as a result of the medical establishment, as a result of academic establishments and the research that they do, right? That all informs the way that communities and individuals interact with treatment and with services that they provide. So for those of you who may be interested in hearing more about this, please comment below. Let us know if you want to have more, if you want us to talk about this more, if you have questions about this, you want us to bring in more experts about this. But these are all important concepts. So we wanted to lay this out so that you all out there understand what we mean when we talk about privilege, intersectionality, trauma, and recovery equity.
Additional episodes will include guests of Dr. Rashida Fisher, who will follow up on some of the adverse childhood experiences, effective trauma on youth and communities of color, cultural humility, Mr. Andre Johnson will talk about experiences in the Black community, stigma, and other matters related to treatment and recovery, and the power of peer support specialists. And Dr. Peter Hayden will further the conversation around creating a culture to effectively engage and treat the Black community. We thank you for taking the time to join Quyen and me as we introduce these additional concepts in the Recovery Equity series. We hope this conversation about recovery issues and challenges for the Black community and the conversations to come provide you with things to think about as you move throughout the remainder of your day and interact with others.
And to everyone out there, please let your friends and colleagues know about these conversations and come back often to catch more episodes of Recovery Equity. Together, we can build a healthier, happier, and more equitable tomorrow.